So this is what leads me to talk a little bit about the Sudbury Valley School, and it's really the Sudbury Valley School that got me interested in all of this line of research beginning many years ago. So the primary place where I have studied children's learning and play and interactions is a school in Framingham, Massachusetts, not too far from where I live, called Sudbury Valley. It's a school that's now been around for almost half a century. It was founded in 1968. It's got hundreds and hundreds of graduates by now who are out there in the real world doing real things. And according to follow-up studies, including a follow-up study that I did a number of years ago, doing very well in the real world. This is a school that just threw aside all of the notions that we have as a school, except for the idea that it's a place where a lot of kids can congregate, and it's a place where there is a place where there's a lot of learning opportunity. It's the basics of the school are that it's a day school. It's not a boarding school. It enrolls children from age 4 on through the late teenage years. Interesting, same sort of age range as hunter-gatherers who are allowed to go out and play and explore away from adults. It currently has 170 students and 7 staff members. It doesn't take a lot of staff members. You don't need a high ratio of adults to kids in a school like this. It operates, partly because you don't need many staff, it operates on a per student budget that is much less than the local public schools cost per student, about half as much. And yet it's able to pay the teachers a reasonable salary. So this is not, it enrolls anybody who wants to come there, unless they've got a disorder that the school feels like they are not able to handle, such as severe autism or Down syndrome, people who really do need special help that the school is not able to provide. So this is not a lead education. You don't have to pass any tests to get into it. You don't have to have a lot of money to go to it. And there are some schools modeled after Sudbury Valley School that have a sliding scale that allow anybody to come, even if they can't afford to pay tuition. The remarkable aspects of the school are that it is governed democratically, truly governed democratically by the school meeting, at which every student and staff member has one vote. Remember, there's 170 students and 7 staff members, so it's primarily the students who are voting. The staff members at this school are none of them on more than a 1-year contract, including Danny Greenberg, who was one of the founders of the school and who's now been reelected to staff year after year. But the staff members are hired and fired by vote of this, by a process that involves vote of the school meeting. You could not stay on as staff if you did not get a majority vote from the school meeting that they want you to stay on. If you're applying for a job there, you have to spend some time at the school, and ultimately you have to get voted in by a vote that is primarily the students voting. All the rules of the school are made by democratic vote at the school meeting, and none of the rules have anything to do with learning. There's no rules about having to spend any time studying anything. In fact, there would be a rule that if somebody were to try to make you study something, they would be violating a rule. There's rules that you can't interfere with people's freedom and rights at the school. Just as you can't punch somebody, you can't make them study arithmetic. So the staff have developed a view that, in fact, they don't even encourage, they don't go around trying to encourage people to learn. They don't see it as their job. On the other hand, they're very likable, helpful people and always willing to help if somebody wants help from them, but they don't seek people out to help. So that's the way the school operates. If somebody breaks a rule, they go before the judicial committee, which is like a jury in our larger society, but it's always constructed in such a way that there's always at least one little kid, one middle-sized kid, and a couple of teenagers and one staff member on it at any given time. Many years ago, I did a follow-up study of the graduates of the school to see if it worked. In my judgment, the only way to evaluate, I guess I think there are 2 ways to evaluate whether a school is successful. One is, are the children happy? If the children at the school are not happy, then the school right off as a failure, no matter what else you could say about it. Any institution that makes children unhappy is a failure. And by that criteria, it's very clear that this succeeds. But even if the children are happy, I would not be satisfied that this is an adequate school if they aren't also happy in adulthood and making a living and not living in their parents' basements, but are actually out there making their own living. And so my concern when I did the first study was what are the graduates doing? Well, how do they... can they go to college if they want to go to college? What if somebody wants to be a doctor or a lawyer and you kind of need to go to college to do that? Or can they do it if they've never done any? Remember, kids there, some of the kids at the time I did my first study had done all of what elsewhere would be called their K through 12 schooling at this school. Never taken a course, never taken a test until they took a college admissions test. Never studied a textbook. How could they get into college? And how could they manage college? You know, we think of, you know, the way we think of some kid missing a week of school and we think they'll fall hopelessly behind. You know, here's kids missing the whole damn thing, right? How could they possibly then go to college? And so perhaps the most remarkable finding to me was pretty much the same proportion went to college as from comparable socioeconomic group. But what was a little different is it wasn't necessarily the brightest kids who went to college, at least the ones that appeared to be the brightest based on that. A lot of them, they didn't feel they needed college. They certainly didn't need college to learn. And they were going into careers that didn't require college. And I'll give a few examples of those in a moment. But others decided for one reason. It turns out that about half of them went right on to college, and another maybe 25% later on went on to college. High proportion, but again, these are kind of middle-class kids for the most part, pretty similar to what you would find from the comparable public schools in that neighborhood. So in the study of graduates, one of the things that struck me was the relationship. In many cases, there was a very direct relationship between what they were doing as kids when they were at the school and what they were now doing as adults in their career. I would say in about half the cases, I could see a very direct relationship. In other cases, you could see a more indirect relationship. But let me just give a few examples of the direct relationship. So one of the graduates at the time I did this study was a captain of a cruise ship. She was a person who, when she was a little girl at the school, got fascinated with boats. And there's a pond on the school campus, and she would float little boats, and she got fascinated with different kinds of ships and different model ships. And at some point as a teenager, she took advantage of the generous off-campus policy of the school and apprenticed herself to a ship captain on Cape Cod. And by the time she was ready to leave Sudbury Valley at about 17 or 18, she was well on her way to her dream career of being captain of a ship herself. There was another student who at the time of the study was a machinist, but really more than a machinist, he was an inventor. He was somebody, if you wanted to build a machine to do something nobody else had built a machine to do it, he would figure out how to do it and build it for you. He was a kid who was involved in constructive play, that kind of play with your hands all the time as a little kid. He led a whole gang of little boys when he was about 7 or 8, building whole villages with plasticine. And at some point, they got to the point where everything had to be at scale. And he would read up books about, he would build factories, and he would read up books about what all the parts of the factory had to be, and they would build it to precision. Somehow he just got that in their head. Why would an 8 or 10-year-old boy have that? Who knows? Who knows why people get fascinated by things? By the time he was a little bit older, he would get staff members to take him to the town dump, and he would bring back bicycle parts and build whole bicycles from them and sell them for a few bucks to other kids. By the time he was still a little bit older, he was hanging out in local garages, learning from the automobile mechanics. And so by the time he graduated, he was well on his way. When I interviewed him, he said, you know, I'm doing exactly the same thing now that I was doing then. It's just that now I've got to make sure that it works. So that's another example. Now, neither of these went to college. Give you another example, didn't go to college. A woman who at the time of the study was a very well-paid fashion designer in the high fashion industry. She, as a little girl, like a lot of little girls, played with dolls, and she made doll clothes for her dolls. And then she went from there to making her own clothes, and from there to making clothes for her friends. And she became, by the time she graduated, she was very skilled in developing patterns. She knew a lot about fabrics and so on. And she apprenticed herself to a pattern maker and went on to her dream job. Now notice, none of these jobs are things that most people ever even think about when you're going to regular school. These are atypical jobs. But we live in this world where there's actually a lot of different ways of making a living. But you've got to be good at it. You've got to know what it's about, and you've got to choose to do it. So here are people, they're not starting off thinking how I'm going to make a living. They're starting off playing, and they're starting out, I really love to do this. And then at some point, that planfulness kicks in, and they begin to say, all right, I've got to make a living. Can I make a living doing what I really love to do? And these are cases, and there are many, many other examples I could give. Some of the more obvious ones are some of the musicians who've actually become successful as artists and computer programs. Nobody's surprised about these things because we expect kids to be attracted to these. But there's also a professor of mathematics who got fascinated, one of the graduates, got fascinated with numbers and numeric puzzles and mathematics as a young kid, and went on. He's one who did go to college, because to become a professor, you pretty much have to go to college.